Acts 16, verses 11 to 15. The message this morning I've titled Undistracted Service. Undistracted Service. I'm going to tell on myself to kind of get started this morning. You know, many of us have plans and visions of things that we maybe are working on or doing in our life. And a lot of times when you start the new year, you kind of get a vision. Here's my year, here's my plans, here's a vision for it. And we get started with a big idea that we're going to try to make happen. Whether that always has happened or not in the past, usually doesn't deter us from making the plans again at the beginning of each new year. But from time to time, I've been known to have a kind of a vision for different projects, and this goes back quite a ways now, a number of years. Somebody gave me a free storage shed. Okay, you know what storage? You see these little outdoor storage sheds, and it was not in good condition. And I got it. We brought it to the house, and it was needed some help, right? The roof was leaking, and the boards were rotting, and things like that. And I had a vision that I was going to rebuild this storage shed and make it useful and be able to store the plethora of bikes that my kids have, because they all have bikes that fill up my garage. And I said, we're going to store this in this storage shed and be able to have this really good use. And I tore it all apart, and I got a lot of the lumber replaced and all of the rotten floor mostly fixed in it. And I had went out and I bought the tar paper and shingles for the roof, and I had some tin that I was going to put on the side, and I had a vision for this shed. That was before I even came here to be the pastor. And the shed's still sitting in the backyard unfinished. Somewhere along the line, other projects, things in life, things that I was doing that I deemed more important became something that overtook my vision, right? I got distracted from the project that I had in mind, from the vision of what this shed could be. And as I stand here today, there's shingles in my basement and a roll of tar paper and tin in my backyard waiting to be put up, because I got distracted from this project. And you know, we are in a society that's full of distractions. We're geared for distractions. The average ability that young people today have to focus is diminishing greatly. We aren't able to sit and think and sit in quiet, because if there's ever a moment of quiet, immediately the phone gets pulled out, or the device that they have, because we have to occupy every minute of our time with some type of distraction. There's no sense of continuing on without some kind of something vying for your attention. And unfortunately, we get distracted by all kinds of things, whether it's electronics or whether it's just goals in life. Many of us may have started out the year thinking, I'm going to be committed to reading my Bible and doing better at this, and you may already be off track. You may have already gotten distracted some days and not met that goal. And that's just a part of life. But I think when we look at this little passage today, we understand the importance and some of the nuances and the facets of what it means to have distractions in our life that take us away from the vision that God has given to us to be in service for Him. You see, this was the situation with Paul and those that were traveling with him. If you remember, back in verses 9 and 10, Paul was going around. He was trying to figure out where to go next. He didn't seem to have direction. There were closed doors with going to Asia. And in the middle of all this, God gave him this vision. Go to Macedonia and meet him there and see what God has, the work that God has for you to do in Macedonia. And of course, this is where the story picks up. It says in verse 11, therefore, loosing from Troas, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, and the next day to Neapolis, and from thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia, and a colony, and we were in that city abiding certain days. The first thing we see about Paul and his companions, of course, he's now picked up Timothy. We know he went with Silas, and there were some others that possibly Luke was along with them by this point, with his company of missionaries as they went to Macedonia, the first thing we see is they were always willing to be made available. They were available wherever they went. They were available to God in his service. When God said, go here, they went there. They didn't dispute it. They didn't question it. When God closed the door and said, well, you're not going to go to Asia, that was fine with them too. They just wanted clear direction. They made themselves available to the Lord. Paul had been trying to figure out which direction to go next. He had received this clear vision, and what does he immediately do? The Bible tells us clearly, it says he took a straight course to Samothracia. Now, this Samothracia, say that 5 times fast, I know. It's a Greek island, and it lies about 25 miles south of the Greece mainland. And so far in this journey, as Paul had set out, and where he's gone in the second missionary journey, he had been pretty much all traveling by land. And when he got this vision at Troas, which was a coastal city, he immediately took the next boat. He said, I took a straight course. I didn't try to go around the long way. I didn't take the scenic route. He says, I took a straight course. And I began my journey to Macedonia. And it says the very next day, so he went to Samothracia. He says the very next day, we took off for Neapolis. This was a port city for Philippi and on the mainland again. And this was what was then called in a region called Macedonia. It's today modern-day Turkey. And then it says, from there he went to Philippi. So it was doop, doop, doop. He went right up around. Didn't stop, didn't pause. The very next day, the very quickest way he could get there, that's how he got there. Philippi was about 10 miles inland from Neapolis. It was an inland from that coastal port. And Philippi was a Roman colony. It was a colony city. And it says then at the end of this that they were in that city abiding certain days. One of the problems that we sometimes make when we begin to say, I'm gung-ho, I'm ready to go, I'm making myself available to the Lord, and I'm taking a straight course to where I feel God's led me, and we expect when we arrive there to be this greeting party that says, hey, I'm glad you were the first one through the line, and let's get to work. But immediately after he takes this short course to get there, it says, now we had to wait. We were abiding in this city certain days. It doesn't tell you how many days, but the implication here is that Paul got there, he and his group, they were arrived, they were like, okay, where are these converts? Where's the church? We're going to build this thing up. And there wasn't anything going on. And so he just had to wait. He waited there certain days. It was a case, what we call today, hurry up and wait. This is essentially what Paul was doing. Hurry up and wait. They had made haste to get there, but now they were looking around and what was there to do? Where was God going to work? Who were they going to be able to encounter? The point, however, is this. In order to remain themselves, to make themselves available to the Lord, they didn't just tinker around with getting there. They made themselves, hey, you told us to be here, this is where we're going to be. And when they understood God's plan, they acted on it. They got to the place that they knew that they should be. Sometimes God can't begin to do the things he wants to do in our lives until we get to the place that he's called us to be. That's not always a region in Macedonia. Sometimes it's just a spiritual place that we need to get to. Sometimes it's just a place in our life that God says, I really want to use you for this, 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 and this. And I've got a big vision for your life. God has a plan for every one of our lives, doesn't he? But we have to begin by making ourselves available to him and getting ourselves to that place where God is able to now utilize us in his service. You see, Paul wasn't doing any good to the folks at Philippi as he stood there in the coast in Troas. Paul wasn't going to do any good until he got to that place physically where he was there in amongst the people. He had to act on the vision that he was given. He didn't say, well, I'm going to wait for somebody else to confirm this, or I'm going to wait and see if maybe there's a better place that maybe God's going to send me. Philippi is not my first choice. It wasn't his first choice. No, he got there. He says, God, this is where you want me. I'm going to get myself to that place because I'm going to make myself available to you. And then this is sometimes what we need to be. We just need to be available, to be positioned in the right place in our lives. Whether it's a physical place God may have put on your heart that you have a burden for, or maybe it's just a spiritual place that God needs you to get to, so that when God is ready, that you're already there. I think sometimes we miss out on opportunities to serve, opportunities for blessing, because we aren't in the place God needs us to be when He's ready to operate, when He's ready to work. But here we see they were available. They were undistracted in their pressing all forward with this vision. But then we see in verse 13, it says, on the Sabbath, we went out of the city by a riverside where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down, and we spake unto the women which resorted thither. This is an interesting little pivotal verse that we sometimes maybe look over, because we see this is just narrative that's going forward. But here it says they were remaining alert for opportunities. They were sitting here, they were in Philippi, they were just kind of biding their time, and the Sabbath day comes. Now, what was the typical way in which Paul evangelized cities up to this point? Well, the typical way was he would go to the city, he would find the synagogue, right? And when the Sabbath would come, he would go to the synagogue, he would worship with the other Jews, and he would usually get the opportunity to present Christ to the unbelieving Jews. And then after those in the synagogue heard about it, some got saved. Typically then he would go and use that as a stepping out point to the rest of the city to evangelize the Gentiles in that given city. This is what the typical order of events was. Now we see something different. Here it's the Sabbath day, and it says, we went out of the city. Now why would Paul have gone out of the city on the Sabbath day? Well, here's some historical context that you need to understand that's already been given us, but we don't always understand first century thought. Philippi was a Roman colony. Philippi had very few Jews in the city. It was a city colonized mostly by Roman citizens, by secular Gentiles. Most scholars believe there was probably no synagogue in the city. There may have been a few Jews, but according to Jewish law that was at the time, there had to be at least 10 Jewish men in the city in order to form a synagogue. So most likely, there was very little Jewish influence in the city at all. They were in a Roman colony, and it was now on the continent of Europe, and there simply was no Jewish presence there. And so Paul gets to the Sabbath day, and he looks around and says, we don't have anywhere to worship today. We don't have any Jews to evangelize. And so he took his companions with him, and they decided, let's go down to the river, and we'll have a time of worship together. We'll go down, and we'll have a time of prayer together. We'll go down, and we'll continue to seek God's face and God's will and God's plan in this, because obviously we've just been kind of hanging out here in Philippi, and we need to get some further direction from the Lord. So they had no other place to worship. They went down, and the prayer was wont to be made. That means they wanted to have a time of prayer together, this group of missionaries. Even though they didn't understand why God didn't seem to be working, why they had hightailed it here to Philippi only to find crickets chirping, they got there and they realized, you know what, we need to stay vigilant. We need to stay alert, because God still must have something here in this. And so what did they turn to? They turned to prayer. I think this is an important point, because oftentimes we, in trying to determine the course of direction for our lives, in trying to figure out where God wants me, a lot of times the last thing we do is really have a time of prayer. The last thing that we tend to have as a point of recourse is to really turn to the Lord, to look to Him, to come to Him in a time of prayer. And I think as a result, a lot of times we say, well, we don't understand where God wants us, and we give up and we walk away. We get distracted. Even when we go to prayer, sometimes it's easy to get distracted, isn't it? We hear, especially if you come here on Wednesday night and come to prayer meeting, we have a time of prayer, and a lot of times there's kids out here playing dodgeball or field hockey, or I don't know what they play out there. And sometimes you can get distracted in your prayer time because you hear other things going on around you. And you know, this is just the reality of the building we're in. But the truth is, we've got to keep our hearts focused in prayer if we expect God to provide direction in our vision. So they went together. They went to spend this time in prayer. They went down to a quiet place, hopefully by the river. Maybe they were going to ask about some wisdom that they needed, or ask the Lord to do his work that he had promised he would do there, or to give them opportunities to share the gospel there. We don't know. Maybe they just needed their needs met. They didn't, we don't know how their finances were at this point. And it says, when he gets there, it says, we sat down and we spake to the women which resorted thither. So there were a group of women down by the riverside. What were they all doing there? We can't say. But when the opportunity came, they were alert for it. They went down for a purpose to worship and to have prayer. But when they saw these ladies down here, even though they didn't come there to speak to the women, and this wasn't their normal way in which they evangelized a city, when the opportunity came to share that gospel, to share the good news, they seized on it. And this is exactly what happened. They remained alert while they were waiting for the next step. And so, here's really what happens to us. This is the same thing. A lot of times we get lulled into sleep in our walk with the Lord. A lot of times we get to the place where we feel like, well, I went and I tried to do what God wanted me to do, and I don't see anything happening. I don't see any movement taking place. I don't really know what the next steps are, and I've kind of given up on the prayer because I just seem like I'm praying to the wind. And the next thing we know, we're not alert to opportunities that God puts in our path. But Paul and his company, they recognized they had to stay vigilant even in a time when they were waiting. And so even if you have plans that to be doing something else, even if you maybe had something else on your mind that day, you must always be aware that there may be a special encounter that God has for you. You ever meet somebody in an unexpected place, in an unexpected way, and you get into a conversation that you never expected to have, and you walk away from that conversation and you realize, God put that person in my life today. God initiated this conversation today. God, some reason, knew that I needed to have this person or have this conversation. Do you know what? God orchestrates these special encounters with people all the time. These aren't things that we can orchestrate, and they're also not things that we should just fluff away as this is nothing. No, we need to see God at work. When God puts you in a particular place and has you encounter with particular people, he expects you to shine his light, to share his truth with those that are around you. We always need to be alert for those types of opportunities. And that's how the gospel oftentimes gets spread. Not always in ways we expect. Let's look at verses 14 and 15. It says, there was a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshiped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. And when she was baptized, and her household, she besought us, saying, if ye have judged me to be faithful unto the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. The third thing we see that kept them undistracted in their service was that they acted swiftly when the opportunity came. They acted swiftly. Here we see just the background. Of course, Lydia. Most of us know the name Lydia. We understand who she was. She was a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira. We don't know a lot about her, but here's a few interesting details. She was from Thyatira. Now, they weren't in Thyatira, right? They were in Philippi. So Thyatira was back in Asia, back in the other continent. In fact, not too far from some of where their travels had just been. It was one of the cities that they would have been nearby as they had traveled on the continent of Asia, what's today modern-day Turkey. It was a smaller inland city. It was in the general direction of where they had come from, and it says that she was a seller of purple. And of course, purple was an expensive and special dye that was used in that time, and mainly royalty or people that were very well-to-do would have been able to buy this from her. And so she was obviously a merchant lady. She had a business that she had developed, and she was known as Lydia, a seller of purple. Was she in Philippi to kind of maybe sell some of this to the people that were there? We don't know exactly what brought her to Philippi, but we do know one other interesting thing. It says she worshiped God. This lady, who had come from Thyatira and was now in Philippi in an unusual set of circumstances, she was somebody who knew about this God of the Old Testament. Now remember, there's no synagogue in Philippi. There's very, very little Jewish presence. But here, just by chance, these guys bump into somebody who knew about their God. They bump into this lady who wasn't from there, who seemed like a random coincidence, and she was somebody who worshiped the God of the Old Testament, just like the Jews. But just like the unbelieving Jews in the synagogue, she was somebody who knew about God, knew about the God of the Old Testament, but had never been told about the truth and the redemption that could be found in Jesus Christ. This is what she needed to know. She needed to know the gospel. And so it says what happened next. She worshiped God, and it says, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. And so it says, the Lord opened her heart to receive this message of Christ. When they began to explain to her what Christ had done and all of the news that they had about finding new life in Him, she responded to that. The Lord had opened her heart to that message of Christ. You know, sometimes when God puts certain people in our path that need to hear about Christ, He's done so because He's already prepared their heart. You know, sometimes we might be saying, I need to be, more about sharing my faith with others, and we do. And we feel like, well, I'm always, knocking on the door, and I'm always trying to talk to people, and it seems like there's always a brick wall. Well, we need to share. We need to continue to sow the seed. But the Bible tells us not all the seed is going to fall on ground that's going to take that seed and allow it to be implanted in their heart. But God does sometimes bring people into our path that need to hear the gospel, who He already has prepared their heart to receive. And this was the case with Lydia. She was ready. God had opened her heart. And what do we see that happened with Lydia? It's interesting, in the same way that Paul and his company remained undistracted, we see an interesting progression that happened with Lydia and her household. It says, shortly after she came to know Christ as Savior, it says she was baptized. So she immediately realized, hey, there's more to this. Needs to be a public identification of who I am in Christ. And even though this wasn't her city or her place, she immediately said, okay, I'm saved and I want people to know it. That's the essence of baptism. We've talked about that before. It's a place where she wanted to be publicly identified as a believer in a place where there were no other believers. It's not like she had the family and friends all come along to cheer her on in this baptism. This was a city that didn't know Christ. They didn't even know the God of the Old Testament. And yet, here was a lady that says, I'm going to be publicly identified with Christ in a place where no one else is. She was willing to step out in her faith. And she was what we know today as the first convert in Europe. First convert on the European continent. And then what happens next? It says her household. Her household had come to the faith. Her household gets baptized. Her faith spreads to the rest of her family. And this is so important because sometimes the family is the first to get neglected. The family is, you're never going to have a greater impact on anyone else with your faith than those that are closest to you in your family. They're going to be the ones that you're going to have the day in and day out contact with. They're going to be the ones that they're going to see whether your faith is genuine. They're going to see whether or not you really mean what you're saying. that the hypocrisy hasn't settled in on you. And we know this today from statistics. There's people that do these polls and things about church going and things like that. There's a statistic that says this: if the father does not go to church, even if his wife does, okay, think about this. This is any church. This isn't even Bible-believing, conservative-type churches. Any church. If a father does not go to church, even if his wife does, only one child in 50 becomes a regular church attender. That means only 2%. If you have a family where only the wife goes and the husband doesn't come, only 2% of those kids become regular church attenders down the road. That's not to say whether they come to the faith. It's just to say that they don't come to church. That's not a priority for them. The father, the family, they have to come as a group. It's so important that your faith is shared amongst your family. And so then, interesting part of this is she gets baptized, she gets saved, her household comes to the faith, her household gets baptized. And then we see at the end of verse 15, she turns to them and she says, she besought us, saying, if ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. This is interesting, because you see what she's asking of the apostles at this point? She's saying to them, you've given me this great, great gift. You've shared this great gift of Christ with me. And she has tried immediately to be obedient to that faith and to share it with her household, to be baptized, to begin to receive the things that Paul was teaching to her. And she turns to Paul and she says, if you think I'm worthy, then I want to share something back with you. Now, is that a different mindset than most people who are giving today? Most people, first of all, they don't see it as a priority to give. She wanted to give of her home, to give of her life, to give of her goods. She wanted to continue to serve in some capacity after coming to the faith, and she saw this as a priority. A lot of people, they move into, I'm now a believer and I'm just going to settle back into my life. She saw this as a priority to serve herself. She saw it as a priority to give of the resources and the things that she had. Her home. She wanted to open it up. She knew that they had needs. She wanted to be a resource for those that were being used of the Lord. But it wasn't just a priority for her to give, which a lot of us have missed today. To her, this was a privilege to give. I don't ever like to talk about giving, because we all think about one thing, about money, and what we need money for this and we need money for that. And yeah, we do. But when we think about our giving, we need to have a mindset like Lydia. A mindset that says, it would be my privilege to be able to have my resources that God's entrusted me with to be used in His service. This is what she's saying. She's not saying, boy, I'm going to give you something, Paul, and I expect a thank you note. Paul, I'm going to open my home to you, but, I'm just going to reduce the rent because, you're a missionary. No, Paul, you better be grateful to me because I'm giving you something that you don't deserve. None of that was in her mindset. She said to Paul, she says, if you think I'm worthy, if you think I've been faithful enough, she says, then I want you to accept my gift because it's a privilege for me to offer this to you. This is a reversal. Instead of us expecting, the one giving expecting the receiver to be grateful, she was grateful for the opportunity to give. And so, what do we see from this for ourselves? Well, when the time comes, we need to be ready to act swiftly, just like Paul. You never know when that opportunity is going to come. When you're down by the riverside doing something, just waiting your time and having your time of worship, and the next thing you know, someone crosses your path. You know what? If you aren't on the alert, you're going to miss those opportunities. Paul didn't miss it. And as a result, Lydia became the first convert in Europe because they were undistracted in their service to the Lord. And what fruit did they produce in Lydia? Well, the Lord produced this fruit that all of a sudden they had a convert who also remained undistracted in her service as well. She wanted to serve. She wanted to immediately accept this vision and be used of the Lord in some way. And this is what really each of us needs to be. I think too many of us, we aren't available. First of all, we don't serve the Lord because we've just never simply made ourselves available to Him. We've had our own ideas, we've had our own distractions, we have our own thoughts about what we should and shouldn't be doing, and really, serving the Lord really kind of has become secondary to us. Because, I've got my own things to do. Some of us also, we aren't ready when we get to that place and we've tried it before and we feel like, well, now there's just this waiting game and we don't know when it's going to happen. We get a little bored. We get a little taken aside. And so, therefore, we're not ready to act swiftly when the time comes, when the opportunity is brought before us. And as a result, sometimes we miss out on the great blessings that the Lord wants to have through us and in us. And I think, just like Lydia, some of us have the wrong idea about our giving as well. We tend to think that we should be applauded for giving. Instead of saying, it's a privilege for me to give. It's a great opportunity for me to have some of my resources that God's entrusted me with to be used in His service. That's a privilege. God doesn't need our resources. I think we sometimes forget that. Well, if I don't give, then the place is going to collapse, going to fall down around us. It's not. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, the wealth in every mine, and He doesn't need my 2 cents to make it stand. It's a privilege for me to give to His work, that He might use some of what He's entrusted me with to further His work and His kingdom in the world today. And we need to have that mindset when we think about our giving. Because all too often it's, well, I have to do this to keep things afloat. Well, no. God's keeping things afloat, but He's letting you be a part of it. And that's a great privilege.